Estão a ouvir-me agora?
Agora sim, houve ali uma interrupção, creio que foi
Não
devido
sei como.
à
Também não estou a ver
gravação.
as outras.
Pois, de repente ficou toda a gente sem imagem. Já estão a ver.
Ok.
Dizia, deve ser por causa da autorização
É
ou coisa assim.
autorização.
Ok.
Então,
Então, tá bem. Então, muito obrigada pelo convite. E, como disse, aceita esta, porque acho que é muito importante também disseminar os resultados, também me dá muita gratificação também. Mas queria preparar um pouco mais. Infelizmente, não deu porque estou com muito trabalho e portanto, é assim. Vou partilhar o meu ecrã. E também queria dizer que eu vou, como eu fiz tudo o trabalho, como a Paula e a Anália sabem, em inglês, vou apresentar em inglês, mas se depois no debate posso falar em português ou como
sim.
achar melhor. Aqui, não sei se conseguem ver. Deve serem.
Sim,
Sim.
sim.
Sim?
Sim, está ótimo.
Tá ótimo.
Okay. So, as you say, my thesis, my research was on women drug prison, the profile and pathway of women incarcerated in Italy and Portugal. Initially, my idea was to include 3 countries, but including UK, because my supervisor is Analia, and the co-supervisor was Emma Plagge, who is a doctor in UK and expert on prison as well. But then because of the COVID, the Brexit was more complicated, and I think it was more than enough to have Italy and Portugal, so 4 prisons in Italy and Portugal. So the rationale, beside the fact that I'm working at the European Union Drug Agency, where I'm coordinating the work on prison and on gender related to drugs, is the fact that both drugs and prison are 2 phenomena that are highly differentiated by gender, despite the fact that often they are treated like they were gender neutral. And women are represent as very small proportion of the prison population, 5-6%, but with very complicated and complex needs and conditions, but often they are invisible, as I say, because the studies, the intervention, they are mainly targeting men, so they are often neglected. The objective of my thesis and my work was really to try to understand better the interconnection between prison, drugs, and women, what is the interlink, but also what is the profile and life pathway of incarcerated women, I say, in 4 prison, 1 in Portugal and 3 in Italy. I will present later the context. If you want interrupting during the presentation, and we can discuss at any moment, because it's a bit long, so if you think it's better, please comment or question during the presentation. So now I can. The other important thing is that a large part of women are in prison for drug offenses. And globally, in the last year, we have seen an increase by 60% of the female prison population compared to 22% of men. That, even though this is mainly related to Latin America, but is an important indication and important to consider when we look at this data. What I use in terms of theoretical background, apart from the gender theory, but from intersectional perspective, because was really important to consider several factors, especially social factors that relate to women's condition, like their social backgrounds, as I say, the social context where they're coming for, the age, and other elements. And then I look at drug studies and the relation with gender, at feminist criminology with particular focus on the life pathway theory, where it is important to look at, say, as at the pathway and of the condition of women and identify key turning point in this pathway, and the women's imprisonment, where there is not much, but I try to look, and is what I found mainly from Anglo-Saxonic literature. So first of all, I look at both drug and prison, looking at the specificity, let's say, of the drug and the women's issue related to drug, but also the differences. And this is from a literature point of view. In terms of the drug field, I use the theory of Zimberg, which is the classical theory, where he say to understand the drug, let's say, phenomenon, we have to put together to look at the relation between the drug, the set where the setting where the drug is used, and the individuals and their biological, social, and psychological characteristics. So it's sufficient to look just at a single drug or a single context, but it's really important to look at all together. And that means also going behind just medicalized approach that usually look at the effect of the single drugs, but then forget all the rest, and also at the criminalized perspective, which are often at least historically, they were the main perspective. I must say that lately we are going to go again toward looking more at like this security perspective. Another interesting theory that I found is the one on embodied deviance of drug-using individuals, in particular women. And this is there are studies conducted by an English expert, Elizabeth Torre, already more than 20 years ago, but I found this analysis quite interesting, especially when we look at gender. And she said that the drug use can be also considered as a kind of embodied deviance, where the individuals, and especially the women who are using drugs, basically they are deviating from, she say, four main functions of the body. One is the self-control, where drug use in itself is loss of control, but even more for women because they are not conforming to the old social role of, as expected, if we think like relax or appealing, etc. The self-image, and again, women using drugs offer an immoral image to the society or of who they are. The self-regulation, drug using reason contrast with the normal social behavior, and the men and women present in a different way also in their self-regulation routine, daily routine. And finally, the most obvious and clear one is this reproduction, because drug using bodies are seen are lethal or damaging the fetus. So that was, I think, a very good point of view to look at how, when we look at women who use drugs. Then I look at the differences between women and men or females, males in drug use and drug-related problems, and I try to look through a narrative review to literature on biological sex differences, and try to look together at the social gender differences, and these in the different phases of addiction. That means in the start of drug use, in the development of problems, and in the consequences of drug use. And interesting, there are several contrasting findings between the biological studies, where it is reported, for instance, that female, and the studies are mainly conducted on animals, tend to be attracted and quickly start drug use more than males. Well, in fact, when we look at the epidemiological data, is exactly the opposite. One key finding in biological studies is the fact that women tend to get addicted quickly than men because of hormonal functioning, but we know also that then the consequences and the harms that are related to the use of drugs are very heavy on men because of several social contexts that are important to consider, like the peer influence and, of course, all the social norms that are related to the use of drugs. And also it has to be considered that many biological studies were conducted in the United States, and now there is some more attention in Europe, but still more in Anglo-Saxonic region on looking at the different biological differences, but they have a lot of limitation because they don't look, for instance, at weight of women, size, so they don't look at the different social context. They look at substances that are mainly used in the United States, maybe not in Europe, and they don't look another important thing that if we have a more feminist perspective, we would look at, they don't look at the different cycle of the life of women. So there are basically focusing on the fertile period. So, but I think the main finding is this, that there are the social components seem to weigh much more in the reality of patterns of drug use than the biological one. Then I look at gender and crimes, and in this case, I think the first question that I wonder was that the fact that women only represent a very small proportion of the prison population, because women first commit less crime than men, but also different type of crimes. And I try to look also how then once they commit crime, how the sentences are implemented, because often we forgot the last part, which is in fact really important. It's not just the legislation that is counting for the imprisonment and incarceration, but is how the sentences are implemented. Historically, the women who committed crime were analyzed for a very moralistic or hypersexualized analysis of crime. For instance, Lombroso was the first one in Italian, by the way, that looked at a female offender, and he was saying the women who commit crime, in fact, they have masculine characteristics, like with a lot of hair and masculine qualities. Or Thomas, he was explaining the women criminality by the fact that by like the sexual act. So he was saying while men tend to be catabolic, release energy. So with again reflection on the sexual act, women by their nature they are anabolic. So in fact, delinquent women deviate from this established model to respond to impulse, to amusement, etc. And then up to Freud, where he's explaining again with the envy of the penis, also the criminality. But then in around the 60s and the 70s, this new branch of study of criminology emerged, which is the feminist criminology, that try to look at the crimes among women, so and the differences between men and women, and put an emphasis on the link between victimization, past victimization, and offending, which is true for both men and women, but is particularly even stronger when we look at women. And this, as I say, we will see also in my research, it's really confirmed that most of the women that I interviewed, they were victims during their life, and then there was a pathway that led to incarceration. And then while it's clear that women commit less crime and different type of crimes than men, so not violent crime and so on, it's less clear how the sentences are implemented because there are also less studies. Most of the studies, at least that I found, show that there is a tendency of the judges or to implement the sentences in a more lenient way. So they are more lenient towards women, but they are more lenient not just because they are kinder to women, but because incarcerating women has a much higher cost than incarcerated men, because women has a function of care in family, children, elderly people that it's difficult to compensate. It is expensive for society. On the other hand, there are theories that say the opposite. Since when women commit crime, they are so much blameworthy, let's say, because they deviate from several norms, that they receive harsher sentences. And finally, there are theories that say that, in fact, the implementation is the same. And I think this is probably an area that should deserve more analysis. Then I look at the analysis of women's imprisonment and looking at historically this philanthropic British woman, Elizabeth Fry, that proposed the female prison as a way to educate women also in their expected role. And so that basically the form the prison have, they are made on these models of a bit paternalistic and infantilizing, and on the other hand, sometimes medicalization, especially because women have a lot of, there is a high prevalence of mental health problem, especially in females prison. But these ended up with having prison that are they are few, first of all, which means that are also far from the residence of most women that are incarcerated, and not adapted to women's needs. Most of the women, this book that I presented here by Pat Carlin and Anne Worrell, showed that they are in prison mainly for drug offenses. They come from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds, the high rate of mental health. Most are mothers. And they have a past of violence with long-term severe social consequences that are much worse than the men because of the result of the stigma, exclusion from the work, the labor context, etc. So then looking at my research, this is the context, of course, I look at the data at national level, for Italy and Portugal, and you can see that, of course, there are large differences because of the size of the country, and so also the number of prisons are totally different. But there are similarity on other elements, like the percentage of women in Italy in prison are 4%, 7% in Portugal, 32%. This is according to the statistics of the Council of Europe 2022, I think. 32% were in prison for drug law offenses in Italy and 90% in Portugal, and the percentage of foreign national in prison are 15%, which is the same in Portugal. It is important to consider, and in the thesis I try to look also at the legislation, which is not very, very different in per se the law between Italy and Portugal, but then the approach to drug policy is very different, as you probably know. Why in Italy is the Ministry of Interior, in Portugal this is the Situation Committee. However, these data, they are the national data, while I just look, as I say, 1 prison in Portugal and 3 in Italy. And those are the prison establishment where I went. So I started in Milano, San Vittore, which is a very old prison where there is a small section for women. Is in the center of the city, has the structure, the classical panoptical structure of the prison, and with not an easy context, because I remember the security staff, while I was facilitated, let's say, the access by the elder health staff that I knew from before, so in prison, the security staff were not easy, and they were not at all, I think, happy for me to go and inside an interview. The women, especially because there was a scandal in this period in Italy, probably Sonia remember, in close to Napoli with tortures and so human rights violation in prison. Then the second prison I went was Porto. I tried to go to Lisbon in Tires, but I didn't manage. And then I decided to go to Porto, which is a big prison with 300 women in Santa Cruz de Bispo. Is the newest prison among the four, with much better condition, and the women they say this, and they have a lot of services for women. I think I will explain anyway later. Also, the drug policy, the drug intervention are different. Then I went to Torino, which is also in the north of Italy, a prison that was built in the 90s, so relatively modern, where also there is a section with around 100 women within the overall big prison, males prison. This prison has a specificity, the fact that they had historically a section for mentally ill people. But then again, there was a scandal as well there because they discovered some human rights violation and so on. But since they recruited a lot of psychiatrists in this prison, they still receive a lot of people with mental health problems. And this is a big issue also, especially for women that are few. So everything is concentrated in a female section. And finally, Venezia, La Giudecca, which is an island connected to the main island. So it's very isolated, let's say. It's a very small section there, also 60, 70 women, completely isolated also because the male prison is in another part of the Venice, and in this case is very old. It was a convent, and it has a peculiarity that until 30 years ago were the nuns that were managing the prison. So it still has this approach. Then looking at the research methods, I use a mixed method approach, exploratory sequential design according to Criswell methodology, where I use both quantitative and qualitative tools, a questionnaire, and then semi-structured interviews with women and with staff, and also try to keep a research diary to try to understand if there was anything that was happening important during the research field, but also to understand a bit more, record a bit the context. In the research, this is more for my methodological part, accessing the preparation of research for entering prison and conducting research in prison, it takes very long and is a very complex, let's say complex, not because it implies difficult steps, but it's long and is necessary to follow several steps. So like first to have the possibility to access prison. As I say, I was refused to basically. It was impossible to go to Tires. I was also not allowed to go to. I wanted to go to Bologna because it's my region, but they didn't allow me to go. And it implies so to really to try to have what you manage to have, especially if you are an individual researcher. Then I had preparatory meeting and a piloting phase in Milano. It's very important to prepare all the logistic because when you are in prison, you don't have internet, you don't have anything. So you have to go there prepared with, I don't know, copies of the questionnaire if you have in different languages, pens and so on, to have a dedicated room that should be adequate for the research. I stayed more or less 2 weeks in prison, except in Venice because it was not necessary. I stayed just 1 week, and the sample was a convenience plus purposes sample, meaning that I approach all women in prison, and then, of course, they accepted or not accepted. And then for the interview, I try to identify those with drug problems. Also, some that they didn't have, just to compare. In terms of analysis, I've done both quantitative analysis with the SPSS. Where I've done this descriptive analysis, frequency percentages, and so on, and analysis of association. And also, I try to have a multivariate analysis, cluster analysis, in order to identify typologies and types of women in prison. For the qualitative part, I've done a thematic analysis with Max QDA, where I try to define topics, and then from the topics analyze a more specific each, let's say, area, and also create some new variables in order to understand a bit of an overview of the sample, and extracted the result in Excel. Try to analyze do the word clouds by theme and the space occupied by theme, and of course I extracted the citation that were relevant for the topic. And very importantly, I think especially for prison is to try to adopt very high ethical standards, because we are working with a very vulnerable population in specific conditions. So we should be sure that first they are aware what they are doing, they are free to accept or not accept, that there is no consequences for them to be involved in the research. For instance, even in terms of logistics, it was important to be quite far from the security staff. So I didn't want the security staff to hear what the women were saying, because they were reluctant anyway, and also because the topic was drugs, so it was even more sensitive. I asked for the ethical approval to university for the questionnaire, and to each woman I asked to sign an informed consent that just remained with me. For instance, the prison in Venice, they asked me to share the informed consent, and of course I refused. This is, as I say, the research method, just to show you the graphic that Cruzula present. So that's the 3 possible models of mixed method approach: convergent parallel model, where you have the quantitative data collection and the qualitative data collection at the same time, and then the complete and relate result in the interpretation. The explanatory sequential model, when you have the quantitative data, and then which is followed by qualitative data collection, and the exploratory sequential model, where you have the qualitative data collection that is just an exploration, and that allow to build the quantitative data collection. In my case, I had the exploratory sequential model, but in some cases I also go back in both, so in a kind of convergent. So it was a mix of convergent and explanatory models. And then I try to give attention to data quality. And for those who want to start a research, I think this is really important. There should be established very high standards since the beginning. So in the questionnaire that is done, I recognize some of the mistakes I've done, for instance, in doing a piloting, which it was done, but probably it was not sufficient. Should have done more times, administer more time the questionnaire. And also in the analysis, it's important to do the analysis several times in order to discover all the problems that are in the data. And now some finding. I don't know, tell me, because I'm not looking at if I'm too long. So data, an overview of the data. So at the time of the research, there were 581 women in total in prison, eligible for participating in the research were 75%. Those not eligible were either because they were working, for instance, outside prison, so they didn't have the time, or because they were hospitalized at the beginning, because they were in quarantine because of COVID. But also, for instance, in Venice, they didn't allow me to interview those that were waiting for the first judgment. It was so small, the number of women that I accepted, even if it's, of course, a limitation. But I think it's really important when conducting a research like that to try to obtain the list of women, even if the names are not available, but with the number that are present in prison, because the prison administration tend to not wanting to open too much to this. Also, another thing to consider is that in each prison, there were present women with different legal status. Only Venice, they have only already sentenced to women, but in all the other prisons, since they were female prisons, they are small, so there are women that are waiting for the first judgment, the women that are on remand, that are already condemned, and so on. So 25% were not eligible, then 309 participates. So there was a very high level of participation. From the qualitative part, 29% refused to participate. Usually, if one accepts, then the other was accepting, because they talk among them and they decide if they want to do or not. Then for the qualitative interview, I did 48 semi-structured interviews, 9 interviews with prison staff. I didn't do interview with staff only in Torino because there was no time, they were not available. And as I say, I kept a research diary. And they were very willing, the women who talk, really to talk and to describe all their history, even if they were very difficult. Here are some basic socio-demographic characteristics. So they were around 42 years, and I just highlighted where there were differences. Foreign national, there were 22%, but with large differences between Portugal and Italy. And this is mainly because in Italy, I went to Torino and Milano, which are large cities with large presence of foreign nationals. And also in Milano is close to the international airport of Malpensa. So there were several women that were maybe arrested in the airport and then or closed and then went to prison, and 8% in Portugal. Another, I think, very important finding from research is 22% of the female prison population, they were Roma. Means in Portugal, Ciganas, then in Italy they were from two groups, Rom and Sinti, but is huge, this percentage, because the prison in the general population is 1%. So basically the society doesn't know what to do with the Roma population. It seems that they put them in prison. Also, the level of education was very low. The unemployment before imprisonment very high. And also those inactive in the labor market, homeless 6%, and having children, so most of them had children, and many children, especially the Roma women, as you can see from the graph. And also there was a high proportion of women who had induced abortion. And then I look at the different phases of life, and I try to put together the qualitative and quantitative results in the interview, but it was coming also from the questionnaire. The childhood was a key period for the women's trajectories, because in most cases there were many negative experiences. Of course, there were also few with very good or normal childhood, but they usually had violence, experience of violence, but also negative school experience, especially in the later years with learning difficulties, and adolescence drug use that was linked to negative school performance. And there were some family members that were mentioning a lot, which were mothers and grandmothers as well, while the father was often absent and neglecting. You can see here some citation from this negative experience. Some story was really heartbreaking, like these women say, at 6, my mother sold me for a cigarette box. Or this one saying, I repeated 6 years at school for misbehavior. I did first, second, third. Here from the questionnaire, I asked them, taken from the literature, there is this theory that adverse childhood experience play a big role in adverse condition later in life. And I asked all these questions to the women, and I found that among more than 20% of women have experienced at least 10 of these adverse childhood experience, starting from a lack of affection, neglect, but also violence in family, less use of drugs and alcohol, but is also appearing, but as you can see also death in the family and also poverty. And then the violence, which I think was the most probably important also finding in the research. These women, as you can see, they were subject to violence. I used the classification of the European Institute of Gender Equality for violence, but leaving apart the economic violence, because they didn't understand as well. I put in a question, and they were saying, as you can see, that there were 42% that they suffered psychological violence, 47% physical violence, 31 and 36 sexual violence. And in the gray bar is reported the values in the general population, where you can see that it was 1/3 of the one that is reported here. And we know that in general, what is reported is not the actual violence, is much less, because there is a change before seeing the actual violence. So this is a key factor, and in the interviews, it was clear that it was not, but also in the questionnaire, that was not just one episode. In most of the cases, it was repeated many times in their life, and also in a very young age, like between 4 to 5% of women had been victims of violence before the age of 10, and 7 to 11% between 10 and 18. Another thing is that in most of the cases, the sexual violence happen in the family context, or intimate context, like as you can see from the citation. So one say, my father raped me when I was a child, or I was beaten practically every day by my husband. My mother never trusted. And this is another important thing, that the role of mothers in many cases was key also for addressing the violence, or try to lead with this situation, because in many cases the mother was bystander, so for different reasons they decided not to support the child or the girl, the women. And as I said, these episodes often they were repeated, mainly from the interview. It came up that they were violated when they raped when they were a child, and then the adolescent by maybe the brother, and then the boyfriend, and then the husband. So, and then in the context of drugs. So that was something that really shocking. And then if we look at the legal profile, so here you have the crime for current imprisonment, and the mean age of first imprisonment, average length, which was quite long, 7 years. And one of the reasons is that in many cases, the women at the beginning, they receive maybe a fine, or they were not incarcerated, but then when they enter prison, they cumulate the many years. So they had these 7 years is quite high as an average. Of course, there are variation. And then in terms of crime for occurred in prison, and you can see the prevalent one is property crimes, followed by drug law offense. With trafficking and drug law offense for use and possession, while only 15% for violent crime and other crimes, which can be also road accident, etc. But the drug play a very important role. And then I try also to ask how many of them were imprisoned because of the so-called acquisitive crime, which means crime committed to buy drugs. And it, as you can see, it was high. So then summing up everything, basically almost 6% of women are there because of drugs, which is very high. So, and I think we should wonder why so women should be in prison for that reason. Then I asked about the use of drugs. They were bit reluctant, I think is an underreporting, but still you can see basically all of them smoke. Some of them started to smoke inside prison. Then 60% have used cannabis, which is, there is the comparison with the general population, which is, the difference is particularly high, but we know also in general for the prison population for cocaine powder, which is the most prevalent now, one of the most prevalent drug use in the community, crack cocaine and the heroin. Then I think in the interview I try to understand, because it's something that often also in the drug field is not done, try to understand what they were looking for when they were using drugs, because this helped to understand the reason, the motivation behind the use. So here there are some citations regarding, for instance, the use of cannabis made me laugh a lot, made me hungry, or when they talk about cocaine, they say it is a feeling of euphoria, superwoman, took me away my fear and fragility. Heroin is, she say, this woman, the person is in the clouds, or the sensation is comparable to orgasm. And then I think that is very significant, saying that opium was a form basically of self-medication, an attempt to eliminate the pain. And this is something that is known also in the drug field, but I think should be more addressed, the self-medication hypothesis. When I asked for the drug use inside prison, both in the survey, there was less than 10 women that report having used drugs inside prison. And I think this is, they were very reluctant, very afraid to use drugs inside prison, because there are very few, they risk punishment and so on. And also is a cultural thing, because I'm working with other European countries and they are much more willing to report. They were reporting more in the interviews, but it's also true that in female prison there are less drugs, because it's more difficult to bring inside everything in female prison, because they are smaller, but also because women, when they enter prison, usually they don't receive as much visit as men. So because usually when men go to prison, women go to visit them, but when women go to prison, they're left alone, many of them. But we know, and they report that the drugs exist inside prison. The way that they are taken inside is through visit, the same way the telephone are brought inside and so on, or maybe misuse of therapy. Then looking at health status, we know that the prison population have an overburden of diseases compared to the general population. And in most cases, this physical problem started before prison, but there are cases where this problem started inside prison, like in this case, severe headache or migraine, a lot of women reporting, And I think the most important thing is that there is a high prevalence of mental health problem inside prison, with 54% also receiving medication for mental health problem, but including sleeping pill, which we know sleeping is a big issue inside prison. And another thing is that there were no statistical difference despite the differences between prison, women, population, etc. Another important issue related to mental health is self-harm and suicide. As you can see here, 31% has committed suicide, and also there were many women also that reported self-harm, both outside and also inside prison. Of course, for inside prison is something that I think the health services, the prison administration should be doing something, and it's because of course is a context that is not supporting well-being and mental health in itself. While I was in Milano, there was an attempt suicide, and that of course was not only probably for a woman who then survived, but also for all the women that were in prison, because then create an atmosphere of very bad for the prison. So then for the prison context, you can see here the reaction, the feelings and changes when the women enter prison and staying in prison. Of course, for everyone was a shock. The feeling of loneliness and boredom is very high. You see, 70% say I feel bored, but also many find a way to have some people of trust inside prison. Most of the time they are peers, so women incarcerated, but in some cases they are also staff, 71%, but also on the negative side, also there is violence and bullying between women, but also with staff, and there are women that are very isolated. As you can see, almost 30% never ever have external visits inside prison. And another thing that's maybe coming from the interview was this confirmation of the infantilization of women. Many women, this I captured especially in the Italian prison because I understand the language better. And they were using terminology that was diminutive, like treating like they were little girls instead, even an old woman. And this is one woman say, it is bad to see a lady of certain age being treated like a child. You can find a 20 years old staff, because often they are young, a 60 years old lady like a child. The prison conditions, and I'm also at the end, almost at the end of the findings, they were in general much better in Porto than in the Italian prisons, that were older, offer less services, often very stereotypical activities, but in terms of drug treatment, they were like more harm reduction oriented, while the Santa Cruz de Obispo the health services are managed by the Santa Casa Misericordia with a drug-free approach. And then I try to do the typology of women, so with the cluster analysis and with the support of the finding from the qualitative interview, I found, let's say, 4 types of women, also using the old typology from Delhi. The drug-connected women, where the main problem is the drug problem. Many of those women were in prison for drug-related crimes, some starting at the first stage, and I think the main issue is that they were with the highest level of education. The vulnerable women with history of extreme marginality, but in this case, a victim of sexual violence and adverse childhood experience, and the high level of mental health disorder. And those were, where you find more self-harming and so on. The Roma women were the most numerous one and more homogeneous, and also I would say the more well, we could say the one that adapted better to the prison context. And then the women with violent crime, which were a minority of the prison population, but internally in the prison, they were at the top of the informal hierarchies. So to conclude some discussion point, I found that gender has really a key role. So we cannot analyze women in prison with drug problem without looking at the gender, the role that gender plays. First of all, because these women are part of the mainstream culture of the two countries where I went. Second, because the gender-based violence played a very important role in all the pathway. And then for motherhood, because all of them, they were mothers and they were talking a lot about the children. And also the stigma was super multiplying for these women. Just a citation which I found very interesting, woman talking about psychologists that receive her in prison. She say that in the first consultation, he say you definitely use drugs because when women cut their hair, because she had like this hair a bit like alternative hairs, and say when women cut hair like that, it means that they definitely feel bad. And she say in the last meeting, when in fact she was just has done some ketamine in vain, he say, I can see that you are now fine. So there is this stigmatization is playing a big role. Then I found also in the research that it's impossible to look at this without having an intersectional approach, because first of all, there was striking similarity between all the women that I interviewed, despite, as I say, different countries, origin, differences in age, etc. So they were coming from disadvantaged background, most of them, but also for them, there were some key social and political changes that represented the turning point in their pathway, because and I mentioned here in this frame the key episode or social events that they played important role. Just to give an example, and then they ended up in prison because of also of these events. Of course, drug use and mental health play an important role, but we have to go back and look at the path. So they started, many of them, as I say, with adverse childhood experience, gender-based violence, mental health, drug use offers as a form of sex education. Then they develop addiction, then they commit crime, often because they are either involved in this content of addiction or because they needed to have drugs, and then they ended up in prison. And finally, the impact of imprisonment. We know that there are several theories on the totalization, institutionalization of prison or as a organization, but so with taking out a liberty from the individual, has a specific and a prison culture that we have to understand if you want to intervene and understand better their relation. The internal relations are important in the prison condition. So it's all together this. And even if some women, especially those using drugs, they say, I don't like the word, they say that prison for them was also an opportunity to stop using drugs and to start a rehabilitative process. But in general, there is this impact on infantilization and disempowerment. Finally, yeah, I would like to acknowledge and thanks, but Analia is here, so in particularly, I finish with just this that I.
Muito obrigada, Linda. Penso que podemos continuar em português, não é? Ou prefere que continue em inglês?
Can you hear the sounds? No. Okay. No, I never manage. Okay, so thank you very much, because I collected the voices of the women, and before the interview I asked to each of them to say one word, and then I put all the words together, but in this audio, but it was not possible. So
infelizmente, acho que I think that there's an option to be
Yeah.
able to share the sounds
Let me see. In Teams.
In Teams, yes, in the
More.
Teams options. More, and then I think there is a part where you can share the sound.
In share or in audio setting?
So more, and then there are audio
more.
definitions.
Wait.
I don't know if
Video,
it is.
audio setting.
I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I'm still taking
Yeah,
baby steps
I don't
with
manage to
Teams as
show
well.
this and never. But anyway, doesn't matter. But they were, I found very touching because they were saying words and they put together Italian and Portuguese and yeah. So thanks a lot. That's it. So sorry if I was too long.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I think we all were listening to you very attentively. Podemos passar para português ou prefere?
Sim.
Sim?
Sim, podemos. Depois, se eu não
Muito
consigo,
obrigada.
eu embaralho, passo ao inglês.
Muito obrigada, Linda, por esta excelente apresentação de uma temática que é extremamente complexa e também que se reveste de muita invisibilidade, como aliás também nos mostrou, não é? E, portanto, tem aqui um estudo realmente muito complexo, muito abrangente também, e eu começava já por perguntar que questões ou comentários é que temos para a Linda. Quem quiser começar. Anália, não sei se...
Pronto, eu só queria dizer uma coisa em relação ao programa. Eu acho que este trabalho foi fantástico, acho que mas acho até que é preciso que, por exemplo, foi feito, a Linda teve todo o tempo a trabalhar, portanto não teve bolsa para fazer este trabalho, não é? Portanto, teve todo o tempo a trabalhar. Acho que o trabalho é incrível, porque também foi durante o Covid, coisa que a Linda disse no princípio, mas muitas daquelas coisas que disseram, eu não consegui ir aqui, ou não consegui, não foi, por exemplo, a tiros, não é? Não. É porque de facto foi um período péssimo, eu não sei, eu ainda me interrogo como é que ela conseguiu, é só isso. E fico sempre com uma admiração profunda pela capacidade de trabalho, pela persistência, e de facto também tenho que dizer isto, pela abrangência do trabalho, a ir para o quantitativo, o qualitativo, portanto foi de facto é um trabalho que eu acho hercúleo, muito consistente, e com imensa informação, muito importante nas suas conclusões. E, portanto, acho mesmo que daqui enriqueceu imenso o campo. Acho que outra coisa que eu quero chamar a atenção, provavelmente vocês não sabem, nem vão saber se não aparecer aí isso mais público, é que a Linda tinha a facilidade de também estar no meio, não é? De estar no meio e, portanto, mexer-se bem, não é? Que naturalmente, se fosse para uma pessoa completamente fora do meio, seria ainda mais difícil. Mas mesmo assim, ela ainda, no meio disto tudo, ainda teve outra coisa que ela teve, tomou a iniciativa de fazer, começou com um grupinho pequeno, que foi naquilo que são as reuniões habituais, 2 em 2 anos, julgo eu, não é? Mundiais, que são organizadas, como vocês sabem, o Observatório Europeu das Drogas tem sede em Portugal, não é? Tem sede em Lisboa. E, portanto, organizam umas sessões. E ela começou com um pequeno grupo de pessoas na área do género e das drogas, e agora, quer dizer, consegue fazer um simpósio com imensas pessoas, quer dizer, Portanto, é fantástica a capacidade de trabalho que ela tem, de organização, de junção, e isto é muito importante, porque estão a ver, ela iniciou esta corrente do género e das drogas, não foi só ela, com certeza, mas conseguiu reunir um conjunto de pessoas, e agora eu acho que da primeira vez foram poucas, mas depois foram imensa gente que se inscreveram. Nós ficámos muito admiradas, não é, com aquela primeira sessão com mais gente que suscitou imenso interesse e foi ótima. Portanto, estamos a marcar aqui o campo, não é? Este doutoramento marcou o campo mesmo das políticas de drogas, digamos, não é da política por enquanto, mas é da pesquisa na área das drogas em relação às questões das mulheres. Depois acho que há um conjunto de coisas que podem ter imensas ramificações. A questão da relação do biológico com o social, por exemplo, aqui é uma coisa que são coisas interessantíssimas que se podem sair daqui mostrando o embrincamento total entre as duas coisas e com o social, obviamente, a ter um peso muito predominante. Acho que esta questão só queria dizer mais duas coisas. Numa destas reuniões, isto já foi dito mais do que uma vez, mas eu estou sempre a sublinhar este aspecto que ficou muito claro no trabalho da Linda. Bom, por um lado, é que as pessoas de facto são vítimas, e isso também é válido para os homens, o que é uma coisa também muito interessante perceber, e depois é que são offenders, não é? Quer dizer, há uma relação entre uma coisa e outra. Mas no caso das mulheres em especial, eu lembro-me de uma discussão que nós tivemos que eu achei muitíssimo interessante, em que alguém disse uma coisa, que é que quem estuda as questões da violência sobre as mulheres não estuda as drogas, quem estuda as drogas não estuda a violência. Ora, o trabalho da Linda é exatamente a demonstração de como uma e outra coisa estão intimamente ligadas, não é? Quer dizer, a questão dos abusos sexuais, ou a questão dos abusos de ser vítima de violência física, ou ser vítima de violência, não é? Na infância. E depois a questão digamos, a história, enfim, que evidentemente também se coloca nos homens, não é? Mas nas mulheres ainda com mais intensidade. Depois, digamos, o uso das drogas para acalmar essa dor criada, não é? E depois mais tarde o dar na prisão. Quer dizer, há aqui um conjunto, uma sequência de coisas que eu acho que se torna muito clara, e portanto eu acho que é muito interessante e muito útil e socialmente como muito relevante o trabalho, para além das qualidades de trabalho e científicas que tem a Linda, que eu acho de verdadeiramente excepcionais, por aquilo que vos contei, não é? De todo o percurso que eu acompanhei com muito interesse do que a Linda fez.
Obrigada, Anália. Também queria agradecer, porque a Anália foi fundamental neste percurso de muitíssimos pontos de vista, porque me acompanhou sempre, me deu uma base teórica e muitos instrumentos que mesmo eu não tinha pensado. E eu comecei, que me lembro no início do doutoramento, me dizia: tu és ainda raciocínias como uma que trabalha na instituição, um relatório, não, e esta foi, acho, fundamental, e também eu suporto absolutamente que foi fundamental para continuar, senão, até no meu trabalho, acho.
Muito obrigada, Paula. Para tirar aqui, voltar a ter som. Sim, Linda, enfim, já conhecia o trabalho, tive a oportunidade de fazer parte do júri, e é realmente um trabalho impressionante, em todos os sentidos, científicos, mas também humanos, diria eu, porque de facto depois a forma como relata, como analisa, etc., faz-nos, cria quadros muito vivos à nossa frente, e nós estamos a seguir com grande até emoção aquilo que vai descrevendo e que vai analisando, e portanto também é muito interessante esse ponto de vista. Mas eu agora queria pedir-lhe, porque está aqui uma aluna de primeiro ano, está aqui alguém que pensa que gostaria de um dia poder fazer o doutoramento, portanto, alguém que agora terminou como foi dito agora pela professora Anália, e realizou o seu doutoramento num período particularmente difícil, um tema particularmente também complexo, delicado, com grandes dificuldades até de acesso ao campo, como aqui explicou também durante a sua apresentação, não foi sempre igual a recepção que foi tendo nos vários contextos. Duas questões talvez principais. Por um lado, o que é que a surpreendeu mais nos resultados que encontrou? O que é que foi realmente mais diferente daquilo que até a literatura já trazia, ou que não esperava de facto encontrar? E depois, em termos do processo de investigação, não é? O que é que também encontrou como principal dificuldade, e como é que foi também gerindo essas dificuldades e esses obstáculos para chegar ao ponto de conclusão, e de conclusão com muito sucesso, da sua pesquisa. O que é que daria também como conselho aqui às suas colegas que estão
Sim.
a
Então,
iniciar-se ou a pensar em iniciar-se?
obrigada, Paula, também por ter participado no meu comitado de avaliação. O que me surpreendeu mais foi de fato, a grande similaridade entre os grupos, porque eu basicamente fiz 3 prisões em 3 cidades diferentes do norte da Itália, ok? Mas onde também havia diferenças de pessoas, porque havia muito mais, como disse, por exemplo, estrangeiros, em Torino e Milano em particular, e menos em Portugal, mas de fato partilhavam os modelos prevalentes eram muito, muito parecidos, cioè eu acho que o elemento do gênero e os elementos sociais contavam muito mais que as diferenças. E outra coisa que por exemplo, que achei muito interessante era esta coisa destes eventos sociais que para elas foram chave no percurso, foram mesmo ponto de volta. Para nós, o Covid, por exemplo, foi uma chatice, podemos dizer, ou em alguns casos, pessoas que ficaram mal. Mas para elas foram mesmo. Me lembro de uma que me chamou muito a atenção, era colombiana que foi intervistar, fez a questionário e intervistar, e ela foi de Colômbia para Estados Unidos. Depois foi o 9/11. Ela disse, de aí, com 9/11 já não davam trabalho aos latinos, então tive que ir à Espanha. Em Espanha começou uma atividade, depois foi a crise, então foi à Itália, tentou de começar de novo, e aí foi o Covid, abriu um bar ou algo assim, e aí parou. Então, como eu tive que. Cioè, claro que eu só ouvi a versão deles, não é? Pero como estava em prisão domiciliária, nós, mas saiu para comprar o medicamento, apanharam, foi presa, e daí foi presa por todos, também pequenas coisas que fez antes. Então, para ela foi fundamental, não foi uma coisa assim, este evento social, como para nós, foi mesmo todas as vezes, que provavelmente é óbvio, mas quem mais é marginalizado, quem mais situações mais complicadas, quando tem alguma coisa assim, depois paga um preço enorme. Depois, fiquei muito também mais que surpreendida, tocada, porque em Porto devolvi, eu contei na discussão, os resultados às mulheres. Foi depois de, não sei, insomma, quando tive os primeiros resultados, também a administração penitenciária de Porto era muito disponível, era muito aberta, assim. Então foi lá. Nunca tive tanta atenção em uma apresentação de investigação assim, um interesse impressionante. Claramente eu estava a falar da vida delas, portanto estavam interessadas, mas com uma atenção, uma ativação, impressionante. E isto foi mesmo super, eu acho muito interessante, que é uma coisa que não se faz e se deveria fazer mais, porque, appunto, ela também, eu não disse nada, falei só da parte de vitimização, mas também ela eram agentes para algumas coisas, né? Por exemplo, também uma parte que provavelmente é muito de gênero, não? Muitas diziam, versão delas, que, não sei, cometiam um crime, ela e o partner não assumia a responsabilidade e ela assumiam até aquela dele, não é? E muitas vezes era porque estavam atrás dele para, não sei, traficar droga ou coisas assim. Mas tomavam a responsabilidade das ações. Depois, as dificuldades maiores no processo de investigação, um pouco aquilo que dizia a Anália, que ponto, se eu não tinha contatos meus, era muito complicado conseguir ter acesso, porque há esta diffidência, não, das prisões a receber investigadores, mesmo se há muitos, muitas vezes, mas há também diffidência. Depois me parecia na parte de análise de nunca conseguir acabar, porque era um círculo, depois encontrava erro, depois voltava atrás, depois e também outra coisa, se fazia agora, como dizia, o meu piloting foi, acho que foi curto. Para uma que faz uma investigação, eu acho que se um tem a certeza do instrumento, é melhor passar 3 meses a ter o instrumento certo, provavelmente mais curto do meu, e para depois, porque senão não, cioè, isto depois cria problema, porque depois se modificas, encontras um erro, modificas depois não é comparável com antes. Então, ter uma metodologia muito segura e confrontar-se. Eu me confrontei com a Nália assim, mas ela dizia: espera, eu queria avançar. E acho que isso, de fato, se esperava um bocadinho mais, era mais certo. Mas depois, sim. E acho que também, por exemplo, seguir as aulas no primeiro ano, eu fiz tudo, mas se fazia agora, até fazia com um pouco mais atenção, porque a parte da literatura é muito importante, dá uma abertura muito grande e há pequenos conselhos. Eu me lembro outra vez a Anália que me disse: mas tu vas, uma coisa sembra, vais nas referências, das referências, depois encontras outras referências, é super útil, perché de fatto ti dà un percorso di analisi teórica che è fondamentale. Acho que este foi um pouco. E depois que sim, queria acabar, finalmente consegui. Mas bom, foi.
Obrigada.
Obrigada também. Mais alguma questão?
A Náusica seguiu. Natácia. Natasha, desculpa.
Sorry, I go
Sabe
in
porque é que eu te
English.
chamei Náusica, não sabe?
No, yeah, no
Natasha,
worries.
desculpe.
I go in English, sorry, because my
Okay.
Portuguese still needs some improvement, but you can answer the language.
No,
if
no,
you
I
prefer.
can
I
answer
can
in
understand. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your research. I really find it really important, first of all, and timely also for all the topics you put together and the intersectional approach you try to use for understanding better the condition of women in prison. I also have to say that I'm Italian, and my hometown is in the Venice area, so I know very well the condition of Giudecca prison that you studied there. So I mean, I feel particularly attached from that example. I have actually maybe two curiosity about your research. The first one is that you use a lot the word vulnerable group and vulnerability, which is a topic I am really also investigate in a different context. But I was curious about do the people you interviewed used the term vulnerable to describe themselves, for example, as belonging to vulnerable group, or they use other framing for touching this question. I asking because, for example, for asylum seekers nowadays, that vulnerability is also, let's say, a non-codified but legal language that is used attached to human rights. So asylum seekers tend to describe when they arrive, for example, in Italy, as belonging to vulnerable group because they hope that this somehow facilitate their request. So I was just wondering if also they use the term vulnerable to describe themselves. And the other question was about if did they tell you something about some sort of at least community of group that is created in prison, like at least some forms of a collective experience in prison, or I imagine that the loneliness is of course the main the main situation, but are there forms of collective experience inside the prison among women especially, or they did not talk at all about that? Thank you.
Grazie. So we are 3 Italians here. No, Giudecca was super a part that is a beautiful island. If beautiful part of Venice, if somebody want to go, because it's just for the other, so it's really 1 minute from the main island, and it is when I went, it was December, it was nobody. So that was interesting. I think I use probably more vulnerability more than I use even in the thesis. They don't use this word. They don't use this word. And I think most of them, but first, many have very low level of education, so they use more basic words, no? And second, maybe they talk about poverty, difficulties, practical difficulties, and then they talk about violence and or feelings they were talking. So this is something, probably it's something more coming bit from the theory, but also from our language, as you say, that probably we have also to rethink a little bit. For instance, in my work on prison, I insisted, and now I think everybody understand that we don't have to use the word prisoner because it's a bit stigmatizing. So we suggest to use people living in prison. It's a bit long, but I think it's better. So I would say no, they don't use the term vulnerability, even if according to our standard, most of them, they were a vulnerable group. Yeah, and the second, in terms of community of groups, so many of them, they found usually friends inside prison. I say one person of trust and so on. They say the others, not themselves, very few, say have a sexual relation inside prison and so on. But I wouldn't say they created the groups of mutual support. Maybe 1-2 person in some cases, mostly among the women with this drug using path, that they were the most educated and so on. The strongest links in terms of groups inside prison were among the Roma people, because there were many, because for them it was not so difficult compared to the external condition to be in prison, and because in some cases I found entire families. So I remember in Porto, I found there was the daughter, the mother, the grandmother, all in the same cell. So, or in Giudecca, I found 2 sisters from also, they were Rom. They were Rom. So they have they have a lot of power, because there are these internal hierarchies. They have a lot of power, the Roma women inside prison. Otherwise, there are those with the violent crime. But I wouldn't say that there are a group of between them. Then another thing that I found, but is, I would say, more negative than there are external groups that are going inside from, especially in Porto, I found, because in Italy it's not so common to have evangelic church, no? These that they went there for charity, so, and then they managed to link, they say they give them goods and so on. And in this moment, in this way, they managed to link to them, so which is so really, really bad, I think, because it's proselytism with poor people, basically. Yeah. This is what I found, and then there are very strange relations between them, a lot of conflict, because the context doesn't help, and depends a lot how the security guards behave. So like in Porto, the atmosphere was much better because the security guard, they were super well educated, they had training. I had the interview with the chief guard, who was a woman who studied psychology. So really, while in Italy, especially Milano, was terrible. So they were very low educated. They treated the women in a terrible way. So it's yeah.
Grazie.
Prego.
Muito obrigada. Pergunto se há mais alguma questão ou comentário.
Eu só queria, até por causa desta comparação entre Portugal e Itália, embora Passos de Ferreira também seja uma exceção, ou seja, se fosse a tiros não era a mesma coisa, não é? Acho eu. Mas se não se sentia, de facto, também uma atmosfera que tem que ver com a nossa, quer dizer, a política das drogas em Portugal há muitos anos, e agora se calhar já está a perder outra vez, não é? Mas ter-se baseado muito numa lógica de que o toxicodependente é um doente e não é um criminoso, não é? E que isso contaminou teve um efeito, eu sei, porque, quer dizer, no inquérito que fiz às prisões, não é? Já havia, o inquérito foi feito em 2001, e, portanto, já havia a visão, maioritariamente dos diretores dos estabelecimentos prisionais, de que o toxicodependente não era um criminoso, não é? E, portanto, acho que isso foi importante porque mostrou um bocadinho como a política pública pode mudar, não é? E ao desenvolver-se as coisas deste género, isso tem como implicação que desenvolvem-se políticas de diminuição de danos e diminuição do risco, desenvolvem-se políticas no sentido de exatamente o contrário do que agora está a começar outra vez a voltar, não é? A ideia de que tem que ser tudo à força e que as questões da segurança a voltarem. Portanto, agora esta visão desde 14, a visão que nós tivemos sobre as drogas desde 14 também foi sendo muito alta, muito pouca, os fundos, etc., foram sendo muito pouco apoiadas, não é? Portanto, não sei o que é que tu dizes sobre isso, quer dizer, embora o que é que...
Sì, cioè dos datos non emergiu una grande differenza, mas também não são muito representativo. E também eu acho que conta muito esta coisa porque quando as pessoas falam disso, parece que falam só de drug law offenses, quando infatti o resto dos crimes relacionados são muito importantes. Eu não analisei a atmosfera neste sentido, mas certeza se notava una grande differenza come cultural geral, per esempio comparando Milano, Giudecca, depois che era un convento antes, e Porto, pelo menos como condições e oferta do serviço. Por exemplo, em Portugal, eu não sabia, é obrigatório os professores, eles têm escola até o final da secundária, dentro da prisão. Em Itália, não. Não há. E os professores, se encontrar um ou dois, são obrigados a ir. Não é que podem, é só escolha. Em Itália, sim, há uma aula assim e lá. E isto eu acho que reparei bastante claramente. Depois, vabbè, havia os prós e cons, tipo, in Italia applicano o contrato de trabalho normal, coletivo, para quem trabalha, portanto, tem direito a férias, a reforma, assim. Mesmo se depois, coisa que não acontece em Portugal, esses são mais gerais, lhe fazem pagar a prisão. Cioè, se eles trabalham, tem que detrar um bocadinho do custo de manter-se, de viver em prisão. Se não conseguem trabalhar, quando saem da prisão, chega uma fatura com o custo da estadia, basicamente, como se era um hotel. Que é impressionante, cioè, já não tem nada e ainda por cima tem que pagar. Provavelmente não pagam.
Portanto,
Mas
a
sim,
maioria deles trabalham, claro, não é? Portanto, a maioria trabalha.
em Portugal trabalhava muito, in Italia non todas, Perché dipende da oferta che tá, perché in Portugal
Também, sim.
aí in Porto stavano organizzados com empresa que iam. In Itália trabalhavam só nos bares, nas cooperativas sociais que faziam algumas coisas, ou por serviços internos, assim.
Pronto, desculpa, era só porque,
Não,
entenda,
mas é
estas coisas vão se
acho que
colocar
seria,
agora.
seria interessante verificar melhor.
Uhum.
Obrigada. Temos ainda mais um comentário ou questão da Heloísa.
Olá, boa tarde novamente. Em primeiro lugar, parabéns pelo trabalho e obrigada pela apresentação. Esse tema do gênero e a interseção com o sistema de justiça criminal é um tema que me interessa muito. E durante a apresentação eu observei que cerca de 22% das mulheres que participaram no estudo não receberam qualquer tipo de visita. E a minha pergunta é se durante a investigação você percebeu que isso se deu principalmente por causa do Covid? Ou se foi sentido também um certo abandono dessas mulheres que estão no sistema prisional. Eu sei que a literatura fala um pouco sobre isso em comparação com os homens, mas no caso da Itália, por exemplo, eu fiquei curiosa se isso também aparece. Obrigada.
Obrigada. Sì, esto, no, quando fui a Milano, era mesmo o fim do Covid, portanto, elas ficaram isoladas durante muitíssimo tempo por causa do Covid, e de fato foi onde acho que tive mais response rate mais alto, mais participação, porque estavam mesmo com vontade de falar com alguém, porque estavam sozinhas, mas muitas, mesmo assim, cioè, tipo, tinha namorado e depois ia na prisão e o namorado desaparece. Me lembro uma que dizia, eu liguei, ele não atendeu, depois uma vez me atendeu, me disse que tinha mudado de número, mas e então, em vez quando acontece o contrário, ela vai visitá-los, sempre. São... E outra coisa, claro que não é nada estatisticamente válido, mas que reparai, por exemplo, no caso do crimine violento, são mesmo muito dentro da prisão são potentes, porque muitas vezes, não sei se é um caso específico com pessoas de setor social médio ou alto até, mas sou abandonada muitas vezes, perché sono considerata tão mal pela sociedade, pela família, para todos, que são completamente deixados. Havia uma, não sei, que era anos e anos que não recebia uma visita. Vabbè, matou o marido, una cosa assim, e o filho não queria saber nada dela. Mas encontrai vários casos de total isolamento, que é muito triste. Depois tinham esta questão dos filhos, que estava muito difícil para todas elas, porque é todo exceto, outra vez, exceto as Roma, porque elas têm também uma conexão, uma rede social externa muito forte, portanto, se desenrasca, não sei, os filhos ficam com elas, as outras, os filhos que foram dados em adoção, ou em instituição, ou não sabem, e com a avó, e é duríssimo para elas pensar esta parte, se sentem ainda mais culpadas.
Obrigada. Então, agora a Sónia.
Uhum. Está.
Ok, perfeito, me encontraba. Ok, no, primero obrigada pela apresentação. Foi muito interessante. Infelizmente não conheço muito esse tema porque não é, estou completamente nova desse tema, então não posso dizer muito sobre isso. Mas até há dois dados que para mim foram um pouco interessantes. O primeiro foi que a Itália tem 5 vezes a população de Portugal, mas tem só 2 vezes mais instituto penitenciário, EPIDAL, que isso sicuramente contribui ao inferimento da condição do...
Podes falar um pouco mais alto, porque não estou...
Desculpa, não senti, porque estou a falar com...
Podem falar em italiano. Podes falar em
literalmente,
italiano.
não sei, porque estou com o computador, não sei, a ver se quando acontece. Ok, a primeira é que Itália tem 5 ou 6 vezes a população de Portugal, mas tem só 2 vezes o número de instituto penitenciário e de prisão. Olhando isso claramente vai a empeorar a condição de vida da população carcerária dentro dos presos. e que a mesma coisa seguramente pode ser afetada tanto para mulheres quanto para homens. Outra coisa é um dado que passou um pouco mais rápido, mas foi esse 46% das pessoas que disse que o momento do cárcere era um momento fora da sua vida caótica. E aqui estava a pensar, temos sempre essa visão muito do cárcere, da instituição como uma instituição repressiva, como uma instituição que tenta de mais culpabilizar tanto a pessoa, supostamente teria o objetivo de educar ou de voltar essa pessoa dentro, mas temos visto a maioria das vezes sempre volta com questão de repressão dessa pessoa, de punição dessa pessoa. Mas é interessante para mim essa percentual de pessoas que dizem assim, ok, o cárcere é seguramente uma situação não ideal, mas é mais, não sei se pode ser melhor ou pior, mas seguramente uma situação mais estável que não a minha vida passada. Quanto foi? Isso aconteceu mais na Itália, no Portugal? Qual é a sua impressão dessas mulheres que tiveram esse tipo de resposta?
Sim. Desculpa, eu ainda não percebi bem a primeira pergunta. Tu disseste, tem 5 vezes a população de Portugal, mas...
O número de
não...
prisões, o
Mas
número de
tu
estabelecimentos
número
três
prisionais,
vezes a
o número
de
de...
prisões. Ok. Agora percebo. Não sei se... Allora, a primeira coisa que se viste são... Eu só indiquei números, cioè tem 189 prisões, Itália, e 49 Portugal. Mas também tem que ver qual é, a dimensão das prisões, sabes? Isto em geral. Depois, em termos de sessões para mulheres, tem 5 prisões em Itália que são só para mulheres e 52 secção para mulheres. Sabe? E em Portugal são 5 secções para mulheres dentro de prisões masculinas, de prisões gerais. Portanto, eu acho que não sei se deveria fazer uns cálculos, mas não, em termos de população prisional, está exatamente 5, mais ou menos 4 vezes a Itália que era em comparação com Portugal. São os dados, mas às vezes mudam bastante rapidamente, porque, por exemplo, a ratio per 100.000 abitantes, quando io raccolì erano 89,4 in Italia e 104,7 in Portugal, mais alta in Portugal. Mas também a Itália houve aquela questão do... Agora não me lembro. Como, te lembras aquele que foi torturado, depois morreu em Itália. Então aí fizeram uma amnistia para diminuir também o overcrowding dentro da prisão. Não sei se respondi a pergunta. Segunda esta coisa de sair da vida caótica. É verdade, porque, em particular, para as mulheres com, por exemplo, um uso muito problemático, se não tem outras ofertas, aí tem que parar. Não há solução, não é? Por um lado, infatti elas dizem, foi uma oportunidade para refletir, para mudar de comportamento, para... eu acho que se havia outras alternativas, provavelmente era melhor. Claro que aí foram obrigadas. E se as prisões conseguiam transformar em algo diferente, mais reabilitativo, por exemplo, como falam nos países escandinavos, falavam, porque já estão a mudar eles também, seria de fato uma oportunidade. Depois, claro, havia as pessoas extremamente marginalizadas. Esta que disse, que me lembro muito bem, que foi vendida pela mão para um maço de tabaco. Ela foi homeless desde, me contou, os 11 ou 12 anos, porque o pai era abusivo com ela, e depois ela fugia, depois as pessoas, as polícias apanhavam, mas desde que pude sempre viveu na rua. Não tinha nada, não tinha educação, não tinha nada, portanto ela disse, eu agora, aqui pelo menos, tenho uma cama e tenho para comer. E perché io perguntavo qual è la tua prospettiva futura, le diceva la mia prospettiva è nada, è voltare na rua. neste caso, claro que era melhor ficar aí. Cioè, è tutto un poco relativo, no? Come... Depois há questão do stigma, por exemplo, me lembro un'italiana che era un caso molto famoso, por acaso, di crime violento, ela dizia, agora, quando, prospettiva no futuro, io vou sair do meu país, não fico aqui, perché sto demasiado stigmatizzata, tenho que fazer uma vida nova, não posso... mas eu acho que era mais para estas muito problemáticas, sobretudo de uso de droga, que estavam aí podiam parar, ou aquelas com uma situação muito, muito, muito difícil, marginal.
Bom, muito obrigada. Acho que, para além da excelente apresentação, já percebemos como, de facto, estas questões têm tanto ainda por desenvolver e eu agradeço muito, mais uma vez, à Linda, agradecemos muito em nome do CIEG, por vir aqui partilhar, e não é que estejamos aqui muitas pessoas, mas esperemos que, através depois dos nossos canais, possamos chegar a mais pessoas ainda e esperemos também que continue interessada em investigar e em contribuir para a área, e não só para a comunidade académica, mas também para as pessoas que trabalham com estas questões, que esta parte do chegar a quem faz as políticas públicas, tendo atenção a todas estas questões de género, é para nós realmente fundamental, não é? Portanto, se mais ninguém tem comentários ou questões, então terminamos esta sessão do ciclo. Muito obrigada a todas, em particular à Linda Montanari, pela sua disponibilidade, e até breve. Vamos
Ok,
continuar.
muito obrigada.
Boas festas.
Obrigada, Deus.
Obrigada, boas
Tchau,
festas.
tchau.
Adeus, adeus.
Já, boas festas.